That's going to bring me up to a little feature I'm going to do here on the band YAK. YAK was originally a four-piece instrumental prog band consisting of Robin Hodder, guitar, Cy Snell on bass, John Wynn on drums, and Martin Morgan on keyboards. This incarnation of the band played together between 1982 and 1984 before their day jobs took them in different directions and they had to disband. But Martin Morgan didn't let the idea of the band die. In 2003, he set about to re-record some of the earlier YAK tracks and release them as the Dark Side of the Duck album, which was released in February 2004. The response was good enough that the band got back together for a time, but now Max Johnson was on bass, and they recorded a few more albums. Once again, the band kind of stalled, leaving Martin to begin recording Journey of the YAK himself. Eventually, he finished the album with contributions of Dave Spate on drums and Gary Bennett on bass. The same basic lineup recorded The Quest for the Stones, which was released earlier this year. Now, as I said earlier, Martin was kind enough to answer some of our questions here, so I'd like to play some of that interview for you now.
We interrupt this program to annoy you and make things generally irritating.
So where do your ideas come from and how are they developed? From jamming sessions, doodling, or from your head and heart and then trying to get your emotion onto the instrument?
This is a tricky question. It's one of the great mysteries about music. Where do the ideas come from? I think you've touched on all of the options really: jamming, doodling, or in the head. For me, it's a combination of those things. Probably most of my music is created through improvisation. I tend to just go into the studio and switch a keyboard on and then just improvise. Sometimes you can improvise for hours and you won't get anything. Other times you just go straight in and the very first thing you play will become the main riff to one of the tracks. For example, March of the Horns off the Journey of the YAK album. That was literally one of those occasions where I just switched on the keyboard, went to an organ program, and that initial organ riff was the first thing I played. And sometimes something when you just played something, you think, actually, yeah, I can work with that, and that will become something. And it was one of those lucky things. And obviously, I worked on that piece, and it just became that track, and it led me on to the next part of that track and the next part of that track. It's just music. It's just one of those magical things. Sometimes I will get a tune in my head when I'm driving, or just minding my own business. And that's why I try and carry a dictaphone with me so that I can hum the tune into it, otherwise I'll forget it. And then when I get back home I can play it and then work out whether it's an idea that I want to progress or one I can file away for later. I think it's always important to get a keyboard version of whatever it was you hummed saved away in a sequencer, because when you listen back to it, perhaps in a year or two's time, it might suddenly turn into something else. But if you don't capture it, then potentially you've lost that idea forever. Basically that's how I work with the pieces, through improvisation mainly. Sometimes as I'm drifting off to sleep, I sometimes get ideas in my head, which I then have to scrabble for the dictaphone and try and hum them. And if they're a whole piece, like with the bass line, chords and tune, that can be a bit of a nightmare when you're falling asleep trying to get that down, because when you listen back to it when you're wide awake in the morning, you think, what was that? But sometimes that does work, and I have used that idea effectively. Sometimes I'll imagine, as I'm drifting off to sleep, I imagine I'm listening to a band live that I've never seen before, and try and imagine what they're playing, and that sometimes leads on to ideas that I can capture and record and turn into a track. But it's one of those different things. I look at composers like Ennio Morricone, and they sit down at a desk and actually score out a piece of music. I have no idea how anybody can do that. It's incredible. But for me, it's mostly improvisation and getting tunes in my head as I go about my day-to-day chores.
And what kind of equipment do you use? How and why did you choose your instruments? What, if any, modifications have you made to your instruments to get your sound?
Equipment-wise, yes, I'm lucky enough to have quite a lot of keyboards that I have accumulated over the past 30-odd years. I started out with a monophonic ARP axe when I was still at school in 1978. I was desperate to have a synthesizer, and I saved up for years, as I remember. eventually accumulating the grand sum of £379. My dad took me to the London Synthesizer Centre off King's Cross, sadly no longer there, and we bought this ARP, and I've still got her today. She still works. I was in a band at the time, but clearly I needed more than one note, so we then got hold of a Poly 6 a few years later, called Poly 6. More recently, and when I started to produce albums, I invested in a Kurzweil workstation. I always loved the idea of having a Kurzweil, having seen Patrick Moraz play one with Bill Bruford at a gig in London. I was just completely blown away by this Kurzweil, and its piano sound was just amazing. I phoned Royal Argents the next day when they used to sell keyboards and said, these Kurzweils, how much are they? And they said all about £10,000. I said, thank you very much, and that was as far as it got. But clearly that was one of the early Kurzweils. The prices obviously have come down over the years. I think in about 1999 I managed to get hold of a K2600, which is my baby, if you like. And that's the main workstation I use to create the YAK music. I have actually got a more up-to-date one, a PC3K, which again has got some phenomenal sounds on it. But I actually still prefer the K2600 for recording purposes because it has much more available on the back of it for outputting to inputs of mixers than the PC3K does. There's probably a way around that I don't know, but I just tend to work very simplistically. It's got lots of outputs on the back of the K2600, and out of its studio I can have 4 stereo pairs coming out for the different tracks, whereas I've only got a stereo out on the PC3K. I've got a Memory Moog, which I purchased from Future Music, from New, back in about 84, something like that. I've used her on the Quest for the Stones album. And I've got an ARP Quadra, which is one of my favourite vintage synthesizers. Again, you can hear the Quadra phased strings, fantastic sound on the Quest for the Stones album. I only had her in the last few years, so I didn't use her for Journey of YAK because I didn't have her.
So what is the recording process like for you? Is it tedious and structured, or do you allow yourself flexibility to continually create as you record?
Recording, I wouldn't say it was tedious. It's probably structured, but the way I work is, as I've previously said, through a lot of improvisation. So I tend to use the sequencer a lot on the Kurzweil to build the basics up for any track. So if I get a riff that I quite like, then I put a bass line to it, and then I mess about looking and for inspiration for tunes and things that will work over that. And then once I've built up something that's a basic track, I'll then start again and do it all properly, making sure everything's in time. I tend to use the Kurzweil in song mode mostly. Anybody familiar with sequences will know that in these song modes you've got a limited amount of memory to create your song. So typically when you're working on something that's got lots going on and is quite lengthy in terms of time, you end up having lots and lots of songs which are strung together to make one longer song. So typically a track like Quest for the Stones was, I think, about 15 songs as far as the Kurzweil was concerned, all strung together. And that can take quite a lot of time, because where you string the songs together you can get timing glitches in sequences, so you have to work around the edges of those songs quite carefully. That can be tedious. If there was only one that had more memory in it that didn't restrict you to 60,000 events or whatever these things restricts you to, I'd find that a lot easier. I haven't gone down the software recording line. I don't do anything with Cubase or any of the other programs as yet. I just work using a basic sequencer in real time, probably because I just haven't got into that side of the music yet. I tend to veer away from computers. I know keyboards are computers, but I just veer away from them because whenever I've got a computer, I just get so frustrated. They hang. You load up a piece of software and it says it's not compatible with this or that doesn't work, and it's just like they drive me insane. So I just don't think they like me. So I've veered away from that. I've gone down the kind of traditional method I use an Akai Pro 24 recording studio, which is a a wonderful piece of kit, no longer available. You can still get them second hand, but they don't make them anymore. It's a DPS 24 Mark II. And I think it's brilliant. I use that for all the recording, and I just basically rebuild up tracks one at a time, as you would do in a traditional recording studio. I suspect I will try and move over to software at some point, but not at this particular point. So recording, yeah, I do enjoy that. I enjoy the creativity when it's finished, or when you're working on something and you get that feeling that this is going where you want it to go, and it sounds like you wanted it to sound in your head. That's a great buzz. But if something needs to change halfway through, then that's fine. I ended up, when I did the Quest for the Stones album, I ended up with about 30 pieces or 30 riffs and ideas. Some of them were quite short, some of them were quite long, and I actually drew them all out on a big piece of paper to work out how they would potentially fix together. And those kind of 30 ideas eventually settled down into 2 tracks. So it's kind of a question of working on it until you think, actually, this piece belongs in that track, or this piece belongs in that track, until you end up with the pieces you want, the finished pieces. So it's quite an enjoyable process, but it is quite time consuming, particularly because my time is quite limited. These things take me a long time.
Okay, actually I had about 3 more questions for Martin, but time constraints have led me to want to basically break the interview into 2 pieces and continue my coverage on YAK on another show a couple weeks down the road. One thing I do want to make sure to mention on both shows, however, is that the proceeds for all YAK CD sales benefit a animal shelter that is run by Martin's girlfriend, in which he assists her with, and it's a really worthy cause that I wanted to make sure I mentioned on this show. He talks about this in some of the other answers that I'm going to play down the road, but I didn't want to neglect to mention it this time out. So anytime you buy a YAK CD, the proceeds actually go to help them continue to operate the Tower Hill Stables Animal Sanctuary. So another one of the reasons why I wanted to break my YAK coverage into 2 pieces is that their latest album only features 2 tracks, the shortest of which is about 18 minutes and the longest of which is 23 minutes and 59 seconds. Anyway, I'm going to play the longer track because I do favor it a little. They're both great, but I do like the first track. It is Quest for the Stones, and I believe it will now be the reigning champ for the longest track ever played on ProgWatch. It's from the album of the same name, Quest for the Stones, released earlier this year. Once again, that epic was Quest for the Stones, from the album of the same name released this year by Martin Morgan, Dave Spate, and Gary Bennett, also known as YAK. This track had just about everything that a symphonic prog like myself loves. Dynamics, tempo and feel changes, long and fluid keyboard solos, and long mellotron passages. Did I ever mention that I like mellotron? I think I may have. Those long mellotron passages that harken back to the golden days of the symphonic prog era. Once again, that was YAK, and I'm going to continue some YAK coverage next time around. We're going to hear some more of Martin's answers. Well, it won't be next time, but a couple of weeks down the road. I actually am looking at maybe getting on a feature from Unified Past in the intervening weeks, so look for that.
When one mellotron just isn't enough, call in the professionals. Progzilla, proving that prog isn't just for dinosaurs.